What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
The restaurant was warm with golden light, every table filled with families celebrating their children's achievements, the air thick with pride and the clinking of glasses. I had chosen a dress that was understated but elegant, one that made me feel like I belonged in a room where people toasted to futures brighter than the chandeliers above us. I sat quietly at the long table reserved for Natalie's graduation dinner, my hands resting on the linen napkin in my lap, my heart swelling with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. I had imagined this night so many times over the years while trudging through late shifts, folding bills carefully into envelopes, and telling myself that one day my daughter would stand in front of a room like this and know, deep down, that her success was built on the back of every sacrifice I had ever made. When she stood up, I leaned forward instinctively, expecting words that would make all of it worth it. She tapped her glass with her spoon, a smile flickering across her lips, and began thanking her professors, her friends, her boyfriend who had driven hours to attend. The crowd chuckled when she teased about pulling all-nighters and surviving on cheap pizza, and everyone raised their glasses when she said she couldn't have done it without her incredible support system. I nodded, already feeling tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Then, she turned her gaze toward me, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You did nothing for me," she said, her voice calm, rehearsed, almost casual, yet sharp enough to slice through the table's laughter. "You don't deserve to be here." The sound around us collapsed into silence. Forks clattered softly onto plates, the scrape of a chair echoed as someone shifted uncomfortably, and all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. I should have felt rage, should have stood up and defended myself, should have shouted about the endless nights, the extra jobs, the fact that while she was tucked into bed, I was stocking shelves and wiping tables just to keep her in sneakers that fit and food that didn't come from a pantry donation box. But I didn't. I forced my hands together, clapped slowly, and smiled with a composure that must have looked strange to everyone watching. It wasn't pride. It was survival. Inside, I was folding into myself, retreating into the private cave where memories spilled like water against stone. I remembered holding her tiny body when she was born, whispering promises to a child who couldn't possibly understand them. I remembered sitting in the waiting room of her first dance recital, too tired from work to keep my eyes open, but too determined to let her see me fail. I remembered signing the loan papers that carried my name, knowing the debt would choke me well into old age, but telling myself it didn't matter because my daughter's future was worth every crushing zero at the end of those statements. Around me, the murmurs began again. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered her name, as if to soften the blow or correct her mistake, but she didn't flinch. She raised her glass high and waited for the others to join. They hesitated, but slowly, one by one, her friends and even some relatives lifted their drinks in a toast that left me cold. I sat perfectly still, my face arranged in an expression I didn't recognize, a mask that kept me from shattering into 1,000 pieces. When dessert arrived, I excused myself. My fork had not touched a crumb of cake, my wine glass remained half full, and my chair was pushed back neatly as if I had simply stepped away to use the restroom. But I wasn't coming back. I stood in the lobby for a long moment, watching through the glass as she leaned close to her boyfriend, laughing again, radiant in her gown, the world applauding her brilliance as if nothing had just happened. "Enjoy your evening," I whispered to the reflection of myself in the door. "You've earned it." Then I walked out into the cool night, heels clicking against the pavement, each step carrying me farther from the table where my daughter had disowned me in front of a room full of strangers. The parking lot was dark, the wind sharp enough to sting my cheeks, and as I unlocked my car, I felt a strange calm settle in my chest. There had been anger at first, a surge of humiliation that could have drowned me, but beneath it there was something harder, sharper, a current that pulled me toward a decision I hadn't realized was already forming. The drive home was quiet, the city lights blurring through the windshield as I replayed her words in my head. I tried to convince myself that maybe she hadn't meant them, that maybe it was some misguided attempt at independence, but the look on her face had been too deliberate, too satisfied. She wanted me small, erased, absent. She wanted to write me out of her story. And perhaps that was the one thing I could finally give her. I parked in front of my small house, the porch light flickering overhead, the silence of the street pressing in from all sides. I stood in the doorway, my keys heavy in my hand, and I knew with a certainty that startled me, this night wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The house greeted me with the familiar hush that used to feel like relief at the end of double shifts, but now sounded like a courtroom after the verdict has been read. A quiet that is not peace, but the stunned silence of people deciding how to live with what they have just heard. And as I hung my keys on the hook and slipped off the heels that had pretended to belong in that restaurant, I realized that I could either carry tonight like a bruise I kept pressing to feel the ache, or I could use it like a handle to pull open a door I had been walking past for years. I poured a glass of grocery store Merlot, the kind I could afford without checking my account twice, and stood at the kitchen counter where the laminate had begun to peel at the edges, tracing with my thumb the seam between what I had maintained and what I had let go. And I remembered all the other seams I had held together with my bare hands, from the time the landlord raised the rent and I talked him down with a casserole and a promise made in a voice that sounded steadier than I felt. To the time the car died and I found a mechanic who still believed in payment plans because he had a daughter too and understood that some emergencies wear ballet slippers and a leotard and call themselves a recital. I took my laptop from the cabinet where I hide the things that matter, not because anyone is breaking into my house, but because some rooms are safer when their most fragile objects are not always staring back. And as the screen lit my face in a blue that made me look like a stranger, I opened the portal every parent of a college student learns to navigate the way sailors learn the reefs of a coastline, moving slowly, reading warnings, learning what can be ignored and what will sink you if you miss it. The dashboard still carried the confetti animation from the "Congratulations, you made the last tuition payment" message, cheerful and oblivious, throwing digital paper into a night that had already burned itself down. And I sat there until the fake confetti stopped, then hovered my cursor over the options like a judge reading a sentence she never intended to deliver. I could hear Natalie's voice as clearly as if she were still at the head of that long table, explaining to a world that applauded her audacity that motherhood ought to be a spectator sport where you clap from the cheap seats and never mention who bought the ticket. And I felt the old reflex rise up in me, the one that begged for a softer interpretation and a gentler truth, but another voice, leaner and older and done asking to be recognized, reminded me that respect withheld becomes debt, and debt has terms, and terms must be enforced or the numbers start owning you. I navigated to the section labeled Authorized Contributors, the place where I had quietly linked my savings from a dozen unglamorous side jobs, the money from ironing shirts for the hotel laundry when my hands ached, the money from the late-night diner shifts where I learned that a plate of pancakes and kindness can stop a bar fight faster than a bouncer, the money from selling the bracelet my mother left me with the lie that it could be bought back later, and I read the line that said I could close the account or suspend access or add conditions, which sounded like the beginnings of a riddle only I had the patience to solve. I did not rush, because haste is for people who want the performance of power rather than the permanence of it, so I opened a blank document first and wrote the note that had been forming in some stern room inside me for years, a sentence that held no threats, no pleas, no explanations, only the truth I wanted reflected back at her whenever she typed her password and expected an open door where there would now be a mirror, and I wrote, "Earn it," then stared at those two words until they stopped sounding like revenge and started sounding like a boundary with a backbone. I pasted the note into the field that allowed a short message to appear when account actions changed, a ridiculous little feature invented by a developer who probably imagined parents leaving cheerful reminders about budgeting. And when the preview showed that spare instruction under her name, I felt the kind of steadiness that comes when your hand finally lets go of a rope you have been using to pull a mountain uphill. Before I clicked, I did a cruel and necessary kindness to myself and walked through the numbers the way I had taught Natalie to walk through math homework when she whined that she would never use it, summing the semesters, the meal plans, the housing fees, the parking fines that had arrived like confetti of a different color, the bookstore charges for glossy textbooks that would be sold back for pennies, the late fees that multiplied like weeds wherever a small misunderstanding found room to grow, and I compared them to my bank statement with its commas in all the wrong places, and I understood that the cost had never been the money. It had been the way I allowed her to believe that my love came with unlimited overdraft protection. I pressed the option that read Close Contributor Access and Freeze Discretionary Funds, a phrase so calm it could have been a winter weather report, and the system asked for confirmation as if unsure I understood the consequences. And I confirmed with the same steady click I once used to accept a night shift that would keep the lights on, and then another screen asked whether I wanted to leave a message, and the box already held the words I had chosen, and I said yes, and the system acknowledged the change with a plain sentence that did not celebrate or mourn. I closed the laptop and felt the quiet in the house rearrange itself, not friendlier, not colder, merely honest, the way a room feels when guests have gone and the furniture is exactly where it belongs. In the living room, I found the cheap scented candle my sister had given me at Christmas with a card that said self-care. And I lit it not because I believed wax and fragrance could repair a lifetime of uneven arithmetic, but because rituals sometimes keep your hands busy while your heart decides what to do next. And I sat on the couch and let the flame make the room look softer while my mind wandered to kinder decades when Natalie had fallen asleep with one hand tangled in my shirt, keeping me trapped and grateful on the edge of the bed. And I wondered when the thread we had wrapped around each other had thinned into a fishing line that only pulled one way. My phone lay face down on the coffee table, a harmless rectangle for now, and I watched it with the attention you give to a stray dog that might be friendly or might bite, and when the first vibration shivered through the wood I did not move, and when the second and third followed, I still did not move, and after the 10th I picked it up, not to answer, but to read the first text where her confidence was still intact and see how quickly it would crack, and I placed the phone back down, screen up this time, like a window someone else kept knocking on with increasing urgency. By midnight the calls had become a metronome for a different kind of music, impatience turning into confusion, and confusion turning into outrage, and outrage turning into bargaining, and somewhere between the last, call me now, and the first, please. I am sorry, I did not mean it. I realized that forgiveness and fairness were not synonyms, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person who has mistaken your generosity for a bottomless well is to let them hear the echo when the bucket hits the dry ground, and the hours stretched until the house was the only witness to a new rule being written. When I finally stood, joints stiff from the couch and the long day, and turned off the light, I felt the floor steady under my feet the way it does after an earthquake finally lets go. And I walked down the hallway to my bedroom without looking back at the phone that had begun vibrating again with the persistence of a summer mosquito you will not swat because the noise reminds you are still awake. And as I reached for the door, a shadow moved along the bottom edge of the curtain on the front window, slow and hesitant, and the porch light flickered as if it too were deciding whether to hold steady or surrender, and a soft, uncertain knock followed. Careful and almost childlike, and I stood very still with my hand on the knob, listening to the silence gather itself for whatever would enter if I turned it. I stood with my hand on the bedroom doorknob and listened to the hesitant rhythm of that knock the way you listen to weather gathering over the ocean, knowing that storms rarely announce themselves with lightning first. And though the sound had a softness that belonged to the small years when scraped knees were solved with a bandage and a story, there was a steel thread running through it that belonged to the woman who had painted me out of her speech, so I let the house breathe for the both of us and did not move until the knocking ebbed into a long, embarrassed silence that slid down the porch steps and disappeared into the dark like a stray that had not found the courage to claim a home. I slept fitfully, not because I doubted what I had done but because endings, even deserved ones, hum inside the body like a machine winding down, and when the morning light climbed the blinds in careful stripes, I made coffee in the dented metal pot that wheezed like an accordion, then stared at the phone where notifications had bloomed overnight into a garden of red badges and pleading previews. The count of missed calls a stack of thin plates balanced by a desperate waiter, and somewhere around the tally that would later climb to 72. I understood that silence, when you have trained people to expect your immediate rescue, is a language with cruel grammar yet precise verbs. I let the voicemail transcriptions resolve on the screen while I stood at the sink rinsing last night's glass, listening without listening as my daughter's voice marched through its predictable stations. Beginning with the breezy assumption that a technical glitch had interrupted the stream of money that she believed flowed from a natural spring, then shifting into the clipped impatience of someone accustomed to expedited shipping, then breaking into a frantic chorus where apologies were tossed like confetti with no one left to sweep, and I learned, not for the first time but with a clarity that made my hands steady, that the words "I did not mean it" almost always mean "I did not expect consequences." I wiped the counter, opened my laptop, and reread the confirmation from the account portal, that small bureaucratic sentence that did not care about history or heartbreak, and beneath it the little line where my two-word message would greet her every time she refreshed the page, a mirror. That refused to blur, and I felt a patient, almost domestic satisfaction, the kind that arrives when a shelf finally sits level after years of slant. The next decision surprised me with its calmness, because spite often aches to be theatrical while justice prefers paperwork, so I opened the folder where I keep the unglamorous scaffolding of a life, leases, utilities. The cosigner affidavit the off-campus landlord had insisted on when my daughter wanted the townhouse with the blue door and the rooftop grill, and I drafted a letter that withdrew my guarantor status at the end of the current term. Not a grenade tossed into her living room, but a clock set gently on the mantel, its hands moving with the exactness of rules everyone pretends to respect until they meet the edge of them. I scheduled a cancellation for the auto-reload meal plan that had become her private joke about how the dining hall was basically my wallet with better hours, and I removed my card from the rideshare app one had once installed, just in case. Because accidents happen in college towns and mothers sleep better when wheels arrive on demand, and as I watched the confirmation emails parade into my inbox, I felt a release across my shoulders that no massage had ever touched. The knowledge that the net I had stitched under her had not been torn away in cruelty, but folded up neatly and stored where it could not be mistaken for the ground. The phone kept chiming, then buzzing, then falling into those long moments of breathless quiet that always precede a new tactic, and right on cue the new numbers appeared, a friend I remembered from the dorm move-in weekend. The boyfriend whose handshake had been firm as a salesperson's, an aunt who had not called me since the funeral where she said my grief looked dignified, and they took turns narrating my crimes with imaginative flourishes. How I had humiliated a young woman on the threshold of her future, how I was crushing a dream like a soda can because my ego could not stand being corrected, how family means forgiveness without paperwork. And I let their sermons drift past like afternoon radio because people who benefit from your silence will always brand your quiet as violence, and I had decided that this chapter would be written in ink that does not fade when splashed. To steady my empty hands, I did something indulgent and absurd that made me smile in spite of myself. I drove to the appliance store that smells faintly of cardboard and plastic, and I bought the sleek coffee machine I had been visiting for months like a painting I was not ready to own. The one with the grinder that sings and the carafe that keeps its promises, and when the salesman asked whether I wanted the extended warranty, I heard myself say absolutely with the buoyant conviction of a woman who has finally stopped pretending that she is temporary in her own life. I brought the box home and unwrapped it with the reverence of a ceremony, cleaned the gleaming parts like a nurse preparing instruments, and brewed a first cup that tasted reckless and honest, then sat at the kitchen table and drafted another letter. This one to myself, though it wore the plain clothes of a budget plan, laying out the months ahead with their small dignities and necessary denials, and in the margins I scribbled an inventory of lost things I might choose to replace, not because totems heal us, but because repair has a scent, and I wanted the house to smell like it. Around midday, a message unlike the others appeared, not dramatic or accusatory, but frightening precisely because it was composed, a short email from the university's student accounts office, noting that a hold had been placed pending review. That disbursements linked to third-party contributors would remain frozen while the student updated documentation, that records such as final transcripts and diploma release could be delayed until balances reconciled, and though I had not sought that last sentence, it arrived like weather you cannot control, a low-pressure system touching everything, and I sat there feeling the moral math scrape its chalk across the board, asking how far justice should travel before it becomes theater, and whether theater, when performed for a very small audience in a very small kitchen, could ever be considered public cruelty. The question kept me company while the afternoon leaned toward evening, until another sound replaced the chime of messages, a firm series of knocks not at my front door but at the side entrance that leads directly into the kitchen, the one only family and neighbors with keys use. And when I looked through the small ripple of glass and saw not my daughter, but a man in a charcoal suit holding a narrow envelope with a university seal, his expression professional yet faintly apologetic, I understood that the storm had decided to come inside, and as I reached for the handle, the new machine behind me hissed like a warning that had arrived just in time. The man in the charcoal suit did not step over the threshold because I kept the door on the chain, not out of rudeness, but because boundaries, once named, must be practiced in ways that feel ridiculous at first, and then quickly become the only posture that keeps your spine from curving. And while he introduced himself as a representative from student accounts with a neutral voice that had carried dozens of awkward envelopes before mine, he held out the narrow missive with a careful tilt that suggested he understood the choreography of shame that can collect in a small kitchen, so I let him slide the document through the gap and thanked him with the kind of politeness that refuses to recruit bystanders into private wars, after which he nodded, adjusted his tie with a gesture that belonged to a different sort of emergency, and walked away down the side path where the weeds lean in like eavesdroppers who cannot help themselves. Inside the envelope, a single page waited with a institutional calm of language that has been vetted by legal departments and printed on heavy paper to make ordinary sentences feel like gavel strokes. A notice that a financial hold would extend to records and graduation certifications until contributors resolved their statuses. A line inviting me to confirm that the change had indeed been initiated by the owner of the linked account. And a small checkbox that would, upon my marking, inform the university that there would be no appeals filed from my side because the decision was final, deliberate, and not made in haste or confusion, which I checked with the kind of steady hand I have only when I have already cried in private and wiped the counters. I made a copy for my records, slid the original into a stamped envelope addressed to the office listed at the bottom, and set it by the front door with the outgoing mail, then brewed coffee in the new machine that behaved like a small orchestra when it woke, its low grind and careful hiss performing what felt like competence made audible, and, while the carafe filled, I opened the folder where I had drafted last night's letters and added a third, shorter and colder than the others, addressed to the townhouse management company to confirm the revocation of my guarantor status at the close of the current lease, as well as the transfer of all utilities that still, out of habit and cowardice, ran through my name, effective at the end of the month. A date chosen not to strand anyone in darkness, but to insist that the grown woman who declared me irrelevant could learn, with time and a budget, how to keep a refrigerator humming without the mother she had dismissed in a room full of witnesses. When the email receipts chimed back their cheerful confirmations, I printed them and slipped them beside the copy of the university form, a small dossier of decisions that would not fit neatly into any story told across dining tables except mine. And I stood there long enough to feel the tremor in my knees fade, which is the body's way of admitting that courage rarely arrives as a battle cry and more often resembles an accountant closing a ledger. By afternoon they came in a cluster that looked like solidarity and sounded like theater, my daughter on the stoop with the boyfriend who has never learned the difference between charm and strategy, and behind them my sister, whose talent for editorializing family conflict has always outpaced her willingness to help mop it up, and they rehearsed at my door a series of claims so familiar they could have been taken from a manual. How I was humiliating a young woman who had merely spoken her truth. At dinner, how I had allowed my resentment to jeopardize years of work, how a real mother forgives privately and funds publicly, and, while the boyfriend leaned on the word legal, with the enthusiasm of a man who believes a stern tone is the same as case law, my sister sprinkled in the soft blackmail of shared history, the sleepovers and casseroles and borrowed dresses, as if memories make promissory notes that never expire. I kept the chain drawn and answered through the inch of safe air with sentences that did not raise their voices, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted them to hear the structure of my resolve, that I would consider a path back only when the apology matched the stage on which the insult had been performed. When the work matched the weight of the words, when she took a job and wrote a plan and spent time each week in the tutoring center helping first years who will never have the luxury of believing money is a river, and that until then the net was folded. The ledger balanced, the gate closed, and no amount of pleading would transform a boundary into a favor. They called me cruel, which landed with all the originality of weather, and the boyfriend threatened to involve his uncle, who knows people. And my sister tried one last flanking maneuver by asking whether I was truly prepared to let a diploma sit held because of my pride, to which I answered that pride is what you feel when you refuse to lie, and that love, when it stops performing, often looks like cruelty to those who have learned to call dependence a birthright, and then I ended the conversation by sliding my phone against the inch of open door so my daughter could see the photographs I had taken that morning of the notarized revocation forms and the utility transfer confirmations. Proof that there would be no last-minute rescues performed in the dark the way I had done for so many years. And I told her in the same even tone I had used when teaching her how to drive that she could call me when she had written the apology she meant and the budget she could keep, and that we would speak, not before. The boyfriend muttered that I would regret this, and my sister hurled an old nickname like a rock, but I only closed the door gently and slid the deadbolt, then leaned my forehead against the wood long enough to hear the muffled choreography of retreat. Footsteps down the path, a car door opening, voices careening toward indignation as momentum failed to produce surrender. Late evening carried the kind of quiet that used to frighten me because it sounded like judgment and now felt more like oxygen. And I began the practical ugliness of sorting the boxes in the hall closet that held the last of Natalie's belongings left at my place, the sweaters I had mended, the framed photos from school that she would not hang anymore, the kitchen gadgets she borrowed and never returned, and I labeled each with an address and scheduled a pickup with a courier service that promises next-day delivery to campus towns, not to dramatize exile, but to stop curating a museum to a childhood that would never be reinstalled. And I sat on the floor with a roll of tape and a pen that kept blotting like a nervous witness, writing her name carefully because names matter even when the person who wears them has forgotten yours, and when the last box was sealed the phone lit up with a new kind of message, not a voice or a plea, but an alert from my bank that a request had been made to link my checking account to a payment portal I did not recognize, the attempt flagged and denied, details available upon logging in, and as I stared at that small rectangle of text breathing on the screen like a warning animal, the kettle clicked off in the kitchen and the house exhaled, and in the gap between the two sounds I understood that the next movement in this quiet war would not come as a knock or a speech, but as a signature I had not given, a line someone else had dared to write in. My name. The fraud alert did not arrive like an accusation hurled across a room. It arrived the way truth prefers to travel when appearances have been curated for an audience, as a polite message framed in the neutral diction of banking software. A notice that an external portal had attempted to link to my checking account using a combination of identifiable details and a guest security answer that would have been obvious to anyone who kept a casual inventory of our history. And while the wording refused to assign motive, the timestamp and the IP block embedded in the technician's follow-up email drew a fairly straight line from the townhouse with the blue door to my kitchen counter, where I stood with the phone in my hand and the smell of fresh coffee, making the morning feel almost civilized. At the branch I asked to speak with the fraud officer rather than the teller, not because I wanted spectacle, but because I had finally learned to address the correct desk the first time, and together we placed a freeze, added a passphrase that does not live anywhere in photographs or birthdays, created a decoy sub-account with a traceable alias, and set alerts that would sing loudly into the quiet if anyone tugged at the net again. After which I walked home beneath a sky so clean it looked laundered and thought about how theft begins long before the numbers move, beginning instead with the assumption that access is a family heirloom. I printed the screenshots and stapled them to a letter addressed to the university's conduct office, not because I wanted an inquiry that would leave scorched earth where a commencement party should have stood, but because institutions respond to paper trails. And my silence would otherwise be translated not as grace, but as permission, and inside the packet I did not name my daughter as an author of the attempt, which I could not prove beyond doubt, but I documented the attack vector, the timing, the access point, and I asked that the campus network administrators remind the residents of that address that unauthorized access to third-party financial accounts constitutes a violation of both policy and state law. Language that does not demand a confession yet makes complacency expensive. When I sealed the envelope, I felt no triumph, only the practical steadiness that comes when you decide to stop asking people to read your mind and start writing down what you will and will not tolerate. Then, because revenge has a way of curdling when left to sit, I opened my laptop to the foundation page I had bookmarked months ago and began the application to establish a small scholarship in my mother's name, directed to first-generation students who work at least 20 hours a week while carrying a full academic load, with selection preference for applicants who submit a short essay titled, "Who Clapped for You Quietly?" And while filling the fields that asked for funding sources, I moved the amount that had once been earmarked for Natalie's final year into that new account, converting pain into a mechanism with rules and receipts. The letter I slid under my daughter's door that evening carried none of the heat my sister would later accuse me of hoarding. It contained 2 copies of documents I wanted her to possess in case she ever wanted to understand the arithmetic of our lives. The ledger of tuition payments with the dates black-inked in a column that runs like stitching, and the affidavit from the bank confirming the attempted link and the actions taken, not as punishment, but as curriculum, because if she ever intends to build a world that does not collapse when exposed to weather, she will need fluency in consequence and gratitude. I added a single sheet of paper that would have looked, to an uncharitable eye, like a scavenger hunt, and, to a generous one, like a door held open, a list of campus jobs with start dates circled, the address of the tutoring center with hours noted, the email of the bursar who oversees payment plans that do not demand a parent's credit card, and a sentence that repeated the words, "Already waiting for her in the portal," telling her that the day she can bring me a budget, a pay stub, and an apology spoken at the same depth and volume as the insult, we will have a conversation, after which the net may be loosened, not before. There is a particular quiet that settles over a house when you have done every task your conscience requires, and there is nothing left to perform. It is not peace exactly. More like a ceasefire negotiated between the part of you that wants to be seen as merciful and the part that is tired of being mistaken for a public utility, and in that quiet I cooked the kind of dinner I used to reserve for holidays. A roast chicken with lemon that fills the rooms with the promise that something honest is happening, then ate at the small table without music, without television, without drafting counterarguments in my head, and when the phone throbbed its familiar plea across the wood I let it talk to the air. Near midnight a new voicemail arrived, tightly composed, a message from my daughter stating that she would be speaking to a lawyer and to the dean and to anyone else whose title might frighten me back into compliance, and a second message followed not 20 minutes later. Voice hoarse and small, saying that if I loved her at all I would at least release the hold so she could receive her diploma even if I insisted on humiliating her in every other way, and I listened to both and saved neither. Because love is not an archive of our worst presentations. Morning brought a thank you note forwarded by the foundation from a recipient I did not know, a young man who wrote in long, careful sentences about double shifts at the grocery store and the way a stranger's hand can steady a ladder. And, while his gratitude did not absolve me of anything, it layered the day with a texture that was not bitterness, and I put the printout in the drawer where I keep recipes and warranties because durability comes in many costumes. Later, I drove to the brick building where the food pantry opens its doors on Saturdays, parked across the street, and watched as volunteers filtered in with the easy choreography of people who have decided their time is currency. A young woman in a cap pulled low hurried up the steps, paused with a hand on the rail as if listening for permission from an older version of herself, then disappeared inside without looking back, and though her gait carried something achingly familiar, I did not follow to confirm the symmetry I wanted, because if parenthood is a story about control relinquished in increments, then this was the only honest way to end it, with a choice left unobserved. On the drive home, my phone rang one last time, the caller ID showing her name, and I let it play out into silence, while the road unfurled ahead like a ledger line waiting for numbers that have yet to be written. At the house, I opened my laptop and checked the scholarship balance and the status page at the university and the email from the conduct office that promised a review without promising a verdict, and I closed each tab carefully, then stood at the sink, rinsed the coffee carafe, and set it to dry, telling myself that some truths do not announce themselves with closing credits, they just continue, and that the kindest revenge I could choose, the only one that might outlive the anger, was to keep the door locked, the porch light on, and the note unchanged until someone I once loved decided to earn what she had casually declared worthless.